we're talking often about the wrong things, and talking about the wrong things for many, many years. Until we start talking about more practical things in more practical ways, I think the divisions of interest and ideology across countries and the perceptions and lack of trust will continue to keep us running, in essence, in circles. Let me suggest briefly 4 problems we face, 4 implications, 4 realities, and 4 solutions, if I could. And then I hope we have some time for discussion. So what are the 4 problems? First, we are, objectively speaking, on an unsustainable path of emissions, and climate change is already underway. I don't really want to dwell on that. I don't think in this group one needs to dwell on that. We can't go on doing what we're doing the way we're doing it. Second problem is that we're not standing still. Things are accelerating because of the growth of India, China, the emerging market economies, the overall world growth, the growth of world population. Emissions are rising, so the unsustainability of our current trajectory is becoming exacerbated with systematic regularity over time. To put it quantitatively, the parts per million increase per year is itself rising from what was 1.5 parts per million per year a couple of decades ago to 2 parts per million in the past decade to more than 2 parts per million now. We're on a trajectory that is becoming less and less sustainable. Third, and this I think is really important, is that there's good economics why it's unsustainable, and that is that the fossil fuel uses, which are the main source of greenhouse gas emissions, are the cheapest ways to produce energy in the world, still today. We may say that the green economy is wonderful, it's going to generate technology and so forth, and there's a lot of truth to that, but the fact of the matter is a good old-fashioned carbon dioxide emitting coal-fired power plant is the cheapest kilowatt per hour source of power, or kilowatt hour source of power in the world, if you don't take into account the social costs. So that means that until we take decisions not to use fossil fuel directly, the markets are not going to solve this problem. And it also means that what we need to be engaged in is massive technological change on an unprecedented scale from the point of view of policy direction. We're living in a fossil fuel age, we have been for 200 years, and we're saying we're going to pull that beating heart out of the world economy and replace it with something else as a conscious matter. So that's the third problem. And fourth, what is sometimes said is that the race for the green technology will be enough to solve this problem because whoever gets there first is going to dominate. That's not accurate exactly, because we could have a race for green technologies and still accelerate the use of coal. Those are not incompatible. And in fact, that's what's happening right now. China's on a path of green technology, but it's also building a ferociously large number of mega coal plants at the same time. So we're going to have to take some choices. Now, what are the 4 implications of this? The first one is we need to choose to taper off fossil fuel use and to develop, demonstrate, and diffuse alternative technologies that are currently more expensive. That's the problem. If they were cheaper alternatives, we wouldn't need global conferences. We just need entrepreneurs, and they'd be doing it. And if you say, well, there are entrepreneurs doing it with green technologies, they are doing it, but they're not replacing the coal plants. They're just complementary to the massive use of coal and so on. And what we're going to have in the U.S., unless we take some clear decisions, is a replacement of coal by natural gas perhaps, but that's not going to solve the problem quantitatively. That's just going to mildly reduce the curve. So my second implication is that we're going to need to share incremental costs. We need to measure them, understand how big they are, and have formulas for sharing them, especially between the rich and the poor countries. But those costs are technology-based costs. We don't even know which of these technologies actually in the end is going to prove to be within the range of substitution. Third, we are going to need to find solutions that don't break the path of development of countries like India and China, because countries like India and China are not going to sacrifice their development, leave countries far behind the rich world for the sake of a global target. So the technologies that are going to be needed will have to be sufficient to power rapid growth of 4 or 5 billion people in the world. That's a heavy load to bear. Coal, oil, and gas can probably do it for a while, but can the new technologies? That's completely an open question. And the fourth implication is that we need much more serious attention to adaptation to the climate change that is already happening and that is going to intensify in the future. I think everybody understands this right now. We're in the midst of all of this, and we've hardly begun to face the basic realities of year-to-year life in a destabilized climate regime. But we're feeling the shocks every year all over the world, including in this country. So, 4 realities that I want to add to that. First is that when we talk about financing these incremental costs and the costs of adaptation, which are also incremental, we have to start with a current reality, which is that the rich world does not live up to financial obligations that it makes. And by the way, doesn't feel so rich, but it is rich. Second implication is the rich world is somewhat ambivalent about the catching up of China and India and Brazil and other countries, because the U.S. sees its power diminishing. Europe probably doesn't have exactly the same feelings of this as the U.S. does, but there's a lot of angst, which means that the idea that the rich world feels in a mood to help all of this happen in a smooth way in the rest of the world doesn't exist right now. The U.S. has a real complex about China. There's no question about it. Third reality is the poor world is already suffering massively, and nobody really cares very much. That's a very sad fact of our world. When poor people are stressed for water and they fight, as happened in Darfur, we call it ideology. When farming fails and people face famine and then conflicts break out, we call it extremism. And so we don't even understand what's happening. I mean, we in the rich world don't acknowledge it. And this is another reality that we need to take on board if we're going to get closer to a solution. And fourth, sadly, is the U.S. is a non-cooperative country right now, and it has been so for about 20 years. It signed an agreement in 1994, and for 16 years has done nothing. There hasn't been one constructive vote in the U.S. Senate for 16 years since the Framework Convention was signed. And President Obama definitely would like to do something, but he can't get a vote in the Senate either. So we're probably not going to get the, certainly, well, I won't say certainly, but I think it's a very, very small chance that we'll get anything like climate legislation as advertised out of the United States. Well, I don't know how I can go on to the fourth area, which is called 4 solutions, because it sounds like a bit of a mess. But let me propose what I think would be a more realistic way to address this issue.